Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Özlem Çelik, and I hope you and your loved ones are coping well and feeling healthy today. And as many of other colleagues, we decided to move our monthly talk seminars, Global South Encounters, to an online platform. And in this talk series, as much as like most of you know, but maybe there are some people who are not aware of what we're doing, is that we intend to welcome critical research in sustainability science. And as a part of HealthSys Institute of Sustainability Science of the University of Helsinki, we are launching this talk series with a group of people, Franklin Obengodum, Kaisa Korhonen, and Heidi Bloom, and me, myself. So many thanks to them to organize this and happen it online this time. And today we are hosting two speakers and who are going to talk about the new initiative called EXALT. And it is an international network of scholars, activists, and policymakers who are working on extractivism. And they're going to be our speakers for our seventh talk. And one of the speakers is Barry Gills, Professor of Development Studies at the University of Helsinki. And the other speaker is Sanna Hokkanen, who is an MA student at the same university. And I believe chairing to Markus Kroger, who is also an Associate Professor of Development Studies of the same university and a part of EXALT initiative like us as well. And our speakers are going to use around half an hour for their speeches. And then we're going to have a question and answer sessions for half an hour. And so we are going to use two ways of asking questions. One is you can use the chat box during the talks. So we're going to keep the questions from there. But after that, if you want to ask questions and talk with the speakers, we're going to have that kind of part as well. And what we are asking for you to mute your mics if they're on, and also just off your videos for a better connection. So I'm leaving the floor to Markus.
Okay, hello everyone. So I will be commenting a little bit after Barry Gill's presentation and the talk by Sanna Hokkanen. So welcome everyone.
Hello, can everyone hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. And I am sharing my screen, aren't I?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. I want to make sure that the technicalities are working.
Yeah.
So thanks to Özlem for introducing EXALT and our presentation today. And just before we let Professor Barry Gills, who's one of the founding members of EXALT, give his presentation on global extractivisms, I'll give a little bit longer introduction and briefing on the initiative and what we are currently and will be doing with it. First of all, my name is Sanna Hokkanen, and I'm currently working as a research assistant at the EXALT initiative. So what is this EXALT? We're a new and growing network of scholars and activists dedicated to collaboration and knowledge creation around the multiple pressing global and local crises stemming from extractivist policies and practices. And even though extractivism truly is a concept of our time, it's still rather relatively unknown in many parts of academia, let alone outside of academic or activist circles. For example, compared to concepts such as globalization or development, extractivism might not ring any bells to people on the street or our parents or neighbors, for example. Therefore, there's a need to shine a little light on the central characteristic and problematic building block of our world system. And that's also what we're here to do today. The aim of EXALT is to draw together diverse, systemic, and critical analysis of the phenomena of global extractivisms and the various alternatives which are actively pursued in both theory and practice. So in practice, we want to build a community and a network which contributes to, expands and deepens the concept of extractivism and the role of alternatives beyond just the conventional use connected to natural resources and, for example, cases of mining, agroforestry and hydropower. And we strive to be a welcoming community in which scholars and activists can find opportunities to discuss, debate and work towards a more sustainable and just coexistence between beings and within humanity. So as one of the biggest efforts this year, we are hosting an international scientific conference at the University of Helsinki next fall. I completely forgot to change my slides. So there we are now. So the conference will take place at the University of Helsinki next fall in October 2020. And it will be a forum of interesting keynotes, in-depth panel discussions, and opportunities for scholars at all career levels to share their research. And the themes vary from intellectual extractivisms, urbanity and indigenous sovereignty, to global extractivisms and transitions to alternatives. The call for abstract for the conference is currently open, and it is open until May 18th. The information for submission can be found on our website, exalt.fi. And in addition to the conference, we're hosting other related events throughout the year and working together with other university entities, like we're doing now with Helsis on this one. There's also a EXALT-led PhD course, or rather a working group, which is currently writing a journal article on the very subject of this seminar. So stay tuned for the release of that, probably within this year or so. And as we are a new and emerging network, important part is to grow our community and get interested people and colleagues to join the discussion. Therefore, what you can do right now is to follow us on Twitter and Facebook and to subscribe to our mailing list to be on top of everything that is happening. And to conclude now, I think it's my time to thank you all and let Barry lead us to a bit more deeper exploration of what extractivism means and what we might find within the concept if we study it through systemic and world historical and socio-ecological perspectives. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this discussion. I will try to lead us through my own sense of why this is so important, this concept extractivism. But I will be speaking in my own capacity and not necessarily on behalf of the working group or the initiative per se. These are my own thoughts and reflections, but we do have this wonderful group working through the initiative, really all of whom have made this possible so far, and everything that's being done has been done by much love and volunteer effort. And we have this working group, you might say it's the Helsinki Research Working Group on Global Extractivisms and Alternatives, which has been doing, in my view, truly excellent work together as a collective, co-producing knowledge to write collectively about the field, the emerging field of extractivism or global extractivism. So what drew me to this? I had been searching for a new way of making sense of the crises that we are experiencing in the world. Some time ago, like many of you, I was overwhelmed by reading one major report, scientific report after another about the various parts of our biosphere, which were each reaching a threshold level of breakdown or severe deterioration, throwing up real warning signals about our life on this planet as a species. And so, you know, with my field, I was hoping that we could come up with something that would help us bring new understandings, new sense making to what was driving this, what its form was, what was happening, and what could be done about it. So that's why we've talked about extractivism as an organizing concept, and global extractivism to indicate that it's a global phenomenon. It's a global set of practices, structures, mentalities. An organizing concept, there have been many, such as, for example, globalization, development, capitalism, many others. An organizing concept is something that leads like a door to many other concepts and helps us find a way of understanding them again in relation to each other and how they all contribute to that one concept that you're using as the organizing concept. It could generate new questions, new research agendas, and even a whole new field of study, as many of the other organizing concepts in the history of social science have done in the past. So it's a proposition that to help us make sense of the world that we're in now and the condition that it's in, as a set of severe interacting crises, that global extractivism has a fruitfulness, a utility, that it could be a useful organizing concept. And so I'm going to start by saying my own sense of what I think constitutes extractivism at its core, that is. And I think it indicates types of intervention by human beings into what we have traditionally called nature, but which is the whole web of life on our planet. A Native American First Nations spiritual elder has said, I'll quote, "Mother Earth is the source of life, not a resource." So we human beings create our concepts of value, our social relations around creating value. What happens in extractivism is that those concepts are deployed into converting materials found in the web of life, extracted out from the earth and made into commodities. So it involves intrinsically commodification, and that those commodities are then placed into the circuits of capital to serve as capital accumulation. So in that way, I see that it's also, there's a specific meaning around capitalist extractivism, extractivist capital accumulation. There's also, in my view, there's some of the most important elements that would define a practice as extractivist have to do with entropy, with a relationship with the web of life which is depleting the ability for life to renew itself. And that involves entropy, depletion, pollution, ecocide, the destruction of ecosystems into a radically altered state that's been brought about by human activity, and in some ways it destroys the previous ecosystem. There are many other aspects to it that I'll try to talk about as I go forward, but in the past I've talked about capital as a form of social organization, a specific type of social relations in history, which is juxtaposed to and antagonistic to another form which I've called oikos. You know, oikos being the antipode. It's non-commodified, solidaristic, different mode of human beings, social existence. But capital in history as a practice and as a historical process has been antagonistic to oikos. And you can write a global history. In other words, the roots of extractivism might go back many millennia, and probably do. But we really are mainly focusing on the contemporary period and the the processes which have contributed to creating what we see in the practices and structure of the contemporary period. What we see globally, when we talk about global extractivism, is that it seems that it's becoming an ever more prevalent, if perhaps not totally dominant, but still very widespread practice globally of capitalist enterprises, both in finance and in the corporate sphere, driving an expansionist extractivism on ever larger scale and intensity, and one might argue destructiveness, both of ecological systems, of species, and of human communities and their life worlds, and displacing and dispossessing human beings, as well as driving out multiple species from their original habitats. So it relates. I mean, there's no way that you can separate, in my mind, the critique of extractivism from a critique of capitalist modernity, global capitalist order, but it also leads to a much deeper or deep ecological critique of our world civilization, if you could call it that, that we have created over these centuries and decades and come to the present point. I mean, in the fields of international political economy, I'm going to stop the video now because I think perhaps I'll just carry on with the voice. That's all right. We've talked about globalization of capitalist patterns under the organizing concept globalization, and the creation of global supply chains, so-called global value chains, which has a lot of antecedents in dependency theory and world system theory, leading up to the present formulations of global value chain analysis. Overall structural analysis of global political economy, and of course of neoliberal economic globalization, or for shorthand, neoliberalism on a global scale. All of these, I think, they're now so joined with activism that it's unavoidable to combine their conjoined critiques. Well, that's my thinking. The ensemble of related concepts is very large. And so I would just mention some that are probably the most important. That is such concepts as developmentalism, growthism, capitalist modernity, dependency, underdevelopment, anthropocentrism, coloniality, and then more recent ones like resource frontiers, land grabbing, reprimarization, which has to do with the traditional concerns of dependency theory on primary commodity export dependent, which was a system in the international vision of industrialization created under centuries of colonialism, where much of the global south was relegated to primary commodity extraction from natural resources and export to the global north for the purposes of accumulation and wealth creation in the global north, whilst mainly extracting wealth from the peoples of the global south. So I wanted to bring it to a discussion about the crises, how extractivism is related to crisis, is an element of, aspect of crisis and a driver of global crisis. So I've just recently done an analysis about the triple conjuncture of the present moment. We have climate change and ecological breakdown crisis, and we have a crisis of the globalized capitalist order and of neoliberal economic globalization, combined with the pandemic of corona, or the coronavirus crisis, and how they are all deeply interrelated, and where the climate change and ecological breakdown crisis is the deepest seated historically. When I mentioned the deep ecological critique of our civilization, that this is a very long cumulative process of human beings exceeding the natural regeneration capacities of the earth and causing entropy now on a planetary scale close to
very dangerous thresholds. And where the capital accumulation crisis, that again is deep seated. It's not just that it's happening just now. And these capitalist crises are recurrent and endemic in the system. And everyone will recall the great financial crisis not so very long ago and what followed from it. And the neoliberal economic globalization embeddedness in the world has accelerated, in my view, both global extractivism and has been a driver of the climate change and ecological breakdown crisis. And they together have generated the conditions for pandemic, as we see, both because of the globalization of communication, transportation, all of that in the structure, but also because human beings have so encroached on the remaining ecosystems and habitats of other species in the world, that now there's a kind of rebounding upon us, which I'm sure many of you have already read about, how these are deeply related. And so that I think we are in a special situation historically, that is really the question of all of us, our time, that is inescapable. Now is our time to reflect on it, whilst we are in this corona situation, as a moment where we can reflect deeply on how business as usual, normality, going back to normality is not an option, because as Greta Thunberg has said, normality was a crisis. So there's no, we have to advocate no return and radical systemic transformation on so many levels of ourselves and our social world and our relationship with the web of life. It leads to all of that. That's my view. The critique of extractivism leads to that sort of set of reflections and practical consequences through action, praxis, transformative praxis. So there are many ways you could talk about extractivism, in which we're also doing in our working group. I mean, in terms of ontologies, multiple ontologies, epistemologies and multiple epistemologies, discourses and multiple discourses. Like an organizing concept is that it's not an effort to create a singular theory around which there's scientific and social scientific consensus. I would argue that that's never the case. Certainly wasn't the case with globalization or development or even capitalism. And it would not be the case with extractivism. So that is not the goal. The goal is to use discussion, debate, this, to populate it with empirical studies, to compare, to analyze, to be critical. It's a field in which there would be no consensus and no singular theory. So I conceptualize it like that, in a sense, like a space, in which that's what I think an organizing concept does at its best. And so there'll always be contestation and debate and new research, using many methods, many voices. So it's not about uniformity. So that you can see, so many ways you can see extractivism. We're trying to explore that, as Sana said at the outset, as a group and as an initiative to keep things open, very open, so that many different points of view can be brought to bear on the discussion through the concept. So that you can think about it as a mentality, a paradigm, worldview, even as inextricable from capitalism or from accumulation. You can see it as a regime of production, a regime of capital accumulation. I mentioned extractivist capital accumulation, capitalist extractivism. You can even see it as a model of development, as the neo-extractivist debate, particularly in Latin American context, as discussed, or a strategy of national development, which again has legacy. It's a legacy or drawing upon continuity with colonialism, neo-colonialism, dependency, underdevelopment, in both theory and practice, and all the problems and conflicts that brings locally and nationally when it is pursued as a strategy, a national paradigm of development. Or is it a paradigm of maldevelopment? another sort of concept in the ensemble. And you might argue that global extractivism at present extent, driven by capital around the world, is a key driver of the global crisis that we're in, which is generating a civilizational crisis, a world order crisis. And so if that is the case, then really cannot be ignored. Extractivism is a concept which cannot be ignored and needs to be utilized, needs to be deployed. It is useful. So the other part of it, we talk about alternatives, but I'm going to end up here soon and just end on these two aspects. But the question mark of the post-extractivism, what would that be? I mean, there are two levels or two areas of resistance or attempts to transform extractivism in theory and practice. Many resistances have been, and many of them have been documented and studied, including by some of my colleagues in our initiative. Around the world, local social forces, local classes, local communities, local indigenous peoples who've been situated in their own home and their land for millennia, they resist. If an extractivist project has come in, which has all the characteristics I mentioned at the outset of entropy, depletion, pollution, ecocide, dispossession, etc., asymmetric power relations of violence, coercion, then there is resistance. That's understood, but there are so many different forms of it. Marcus Kruger will come in later, who has written extensively on this, some of the cutting edge work, I think, anywhere, about making sense of resistance around the world. So he'll contribute to that when I'm finished in a moment. But there are so many different forms of organization, types of tactics, types of coalitions, different terrains of struggle, whether that be very local or even globalized, and mediascapes and so on, and global coalition formations. All of that is still part of local, as Gudinas says, that so much of the whole character of extractivism ultimately is local and experienced local by real human beings in real ecosystems that are basically under attack, under threat from extractivism. The other terrain is global politics, I would call it. And there's the dominance of the transnational corporations, the TNCs, and the banks and other financial bodies, hedge funds, private equity, and the like. And how they drive the process and then are resisted. But how? Aside from the local that I just talked about, there have been and are a whole array of different elements of trying to bring transnational corporations and the financial institutions into some binding framework of code of conduct that limits their destructiveness, limits what they can do, and sets up, in a sense, regulation regimes in the international relations sense of rules and order and norms and institutions that would control their conduct and limit the destructive elements and human rights abuses. There's at present a human rights treaty approach to try to bind transnational corporations into a new system where they would be punished for human rights abuses around the world through extractivist practices, because there are so many cases of it where we have evidence, and it's been researched, that a corporate entity itself is guilty of human rights violations, sometimes grotesque, as part of its extractivist projects, or through the International Criminal Court to make ecocide a crime, punishable under law, and that people could be arrested and prosecuted for it, including corporate leaders, finance leaders, government leaders. Is another area. Corporate social responsibility has been around quite some time and is very mixed, especially in how you see the consequences, whether or not it's a form of self-regulation, which is really a form of legitimation for the corporations and changes their conduct very little, or whether it's very serious and really does profoundly change the corporate culture, mentality, value system, and practices. That is an area to still be debated. But it is mostly a regulation approach by corporations. Then there are these ethical codes of investment for banks, for corporations, other finance bodies, which are there and can be, and then even large campaigns globally can be and have been organized around pressurizing certain entities to adopt rigorous ethical codes of investment so that they would stop certain kinds of extractivist behavior, particularly, say, in palm oil or in oil and gas or coal and other types of fossil fuel extraction, for example. There are many of those already, and global civil society plays a key role in that, and courts, using the courts to also to force entities, corporate or finance, into new behavior and punish them for past extractivist offenses. And there's there's always the conservation movement and protection, as controversial as that can often be. There's still that, and many kinds of projects around that to at least protect certain areas that they will not be subjected to this kind of destruction, nor the people who live there and all the other species. And of course, for each of us individually, there's always for a long time been ethical consumerism, where the more research you know that you can do about particular things that you consume, which have come from global supply chains, you can find ways to change your own behavior. It's one element, and for many people, it's a very important central element. But I'm just going to end up with just saying I've been trying to think about this as a turning point where we are right now. That Corona gives us the moment to deeply reflect on, and I've talked about how the linear time of capitalist modernity is decelerating, is in a pause, and that pause gives us an opportunity to think about radical transformations, not just a tinkering around the edges sort of thing, but going deep into critique of our civilization and thinking about what really does need to change. And if I just say that if you I think fighting global extractivism and fighting the climate change and ecological breakdown crises are now inextricably conjoined. They're inseparable in my mind. To resist one is to resist the other. And so if you didn't have an opportunity, I'll just say that you can look for my little essay called Deep Restoration, From the Great Implosion to the Great Awakening, in which I give some critique of the crises, the three, and their accelerating interactions with each other. But also I end on what is explicitly a normative prescriptive tone of the various ways in which I think how deep and how far this reflection and the change in ourselves and how we organize our life in the broadest sense might have to be in a hopeful sense, in a positive sense. So I'll just end there, and I thank you very much for listening to what I had to say.
Okay. Thank you, Barry. So maybe I will follow up on that. So hello, everyone. So my name is Markus Kröger from the University of Helsinki, and maybe this concept of extractivism in its different forms has risen recently globally, because there has been the global commodities super cycle since 2007. The prices of most commodities have been much higher than they were before that. And as we are speaking, for example, the gold prices are booming, and this has led to many problems, for example, in the Amazon for indigenous people who are now facing a full-on attack on their territories by illegal gold miners. Like in Brazil, for example, the environmental officers are not allowed to go to inspect illegal loggings currently because of the coronavirus and so on. So these things definitely work together in different ways, and we don't yet know how does the politics of coronavirus and the planning for that work, which is a future topic of investigation. But before the commodity super cycle even started in the early 2000s, there was already discussion starting in Latin American context about neo-extractivism as a type of new political economic model through which Latin American countries and governments, even progressive ones, could use the new windfall gains from commodity exports to create progressive social welfare agendas, and especially through first safeguarding themselves from the ravages of global financial markets by building surpluses in current account balances by giving leeway for export producers to increase their commodity production. But of course, this created many problems with the local communities in Latin America, which were mostly promoting these progressive governments. And then we had the backslash of populist right-wing governments coming into power, partly as a result of that process where these extractive industries, such as in Brazil, the soybean agribusiness industries and other agribusiness industries of monocultures like pulp production, eucalyptus plantations, mining, and so on, they became much more powerful during the era of, for example, the Workers' Party. So the political impact of that kind of hyper-extractivist period of the commodity super cycle of global land grabbing and financialization, where the 2008 financial crisis led a lot of surplus capital to go into the land investing, led actually into a kind of rising power for these landed elites. And it didn't equalize the economic decision-making power in the same sense. But now these entities, they have created these new plantations, like in that photo from November last year in the north of Mato Grosso. You can see a soybean plantation there, and just a few years ago, all that was forest, kind of a mix between Cerrado and Amazon forests. So what is new about this extractivism, or how I think that it's useful as a concept in distinction with the simple natural resource exploitation, is that the scale and pace of changing landscapes is quite different now. Like you see an expansion of tens of millions of hectares in a matter of few years. And if you have traveled there, it takes days altogether to travel through those areas. And before, just a few years ago, there was forest there, and now there's nothing. You cannot even see the horizon. It's just amazing. And it's global. It goes to markets all around the world to feed the global meat production complex. So there's the converging of the global feed, food, fiber, and fuel markets with the biofuels, bioeconomy, and so on. So in those fields, you cultivate soybeans, and then half of the year you cultivate corn, and you make corn ethanol. And actually, the expansion of those soybean fields has been promulgated in the past few years by the expansion of soybean of corn ethanol, not soybean. And so this global meat production complex produces a huge amount of carbon emissions. Like even when we have all the planes, or most of the planes down, or half of the planes down now with the corona, we don't see such a big drop yet in carbon emissions. And this gives maybe a hint that, like some analysts say, that the global meat production industry might be contributing up to half of the global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, because of the methane and all that. And of course, that makes sense when you look at these kind of huge monoculture plantations and what they have displaced, the Amazon rainforests and so on. So maybe I would continue with this idea of Barry that, yeah, this is increasingly an unproductive process. It's like a lessening of reciprocal relations. So you have this ideological backing there. I think the concept of global extractivisms and extractivism can be used beyond a simple measure of a political economic model or that way of simple physical thing, but there are like ideological things under there. So it's more like just pulling out, extrahere, like from Latin, and then extracting without giving back. So it's like depleting, it's unsustainable. Pollution is a key measure here, like an ever increasing number of pesticides are used, for example, agrotoxics, for example, in those fields in the photo because of climate change. So there's less rain, there's more drought, and then you need to use more agrotoxics, more fertilizers, and so on. and then it depletes the soil in the very long term. So you have longer term negative effects with the increase in extractivism, in the kind of hyper extractivism. And these are altogether ever more irreversible. It's very unlikely that that kind of soybean field would turn again back into a forest, because those areas are like tens of millions of hectares, and you would need to have some forest nearby for the forest to return there. And so it might be a process where, for example, big parts of the Amazon are lost and they turn to savanna. And well, Barry asked me to comment something about the resistance. I will not go into details. There will be a new book coming out called Iron Will, Global Extractivisms and Mining Resistance in Brazil and India in next November. It will be an open access book. But what I say that the key things that I found there when comparing around the world different extractivist projects and resistance to them, especially in the mining industries in Brazil and India, was that most important thing for the resistance to attain success in the best terms for them, that is in terms of canceling whole projects or shutting down mining operations, was to do protesting, peaceful, mass scale, innovative protesting that re-symbolizes key symbols, objects, such as, for example, roadblocks, occupations, and so on. Disruptive protesting. That was really important across all the cases which I compared. And then another key feature, kind of called like a necessary causal condition, was not engaging in so-called private politics. That is negotiations directly without state presence with the corporations in Gessen, reaching some kind of stakeholder dialogue and some kind of agreement. Normally, if that was used, then the results were not so impressive in terms of shutting down the extractivist operations and keeping the resources in the ground. There were, of course, many other strategies which were really helpful and useful and important in many cases. So those two resistance strategies of protesting and not using private politics were necessary but not sufficient. And the other strategies that I used were, or that were found to be useful, were campaigning, especially that kind of campaigning which challenges the kind of modernist valuation of nature, not turning it into natural resources, but saying, for example, that this mountain is our god and so on. Then creating networks, the networking locally, nationally, globally, and then embedding the state, or kind of like co-producing the state while retaining autonomy for the movement or the resistance actor, which can be also an NGO. And there are many ways for this, like trying to shape the judicial arena so that you have new activists more in power in shaping how legal decisions are arrived at, or then you have changes in the parliament, in electoral politics. You make agreements with politicians saying that, okay, we will vote you only if you say that you will be against mining before the election. So you kind of save the electoral politics arena beforehand, kind of co-producing state structures again. And or then you can use institutional politics, like making use of some latent possibilities of some regulatory agencies, filing petitions there, or then putting their own activists or people who are sympathetic, or changing the rules. So actually creating new state institutions, such as in India, they created the Shah Commission to investigate the mining irregularities, and the civil society was hugely important in setting up that special body of the government. But anyway, I will stop here now so that everybody can participate in the discussion. So please feel free.
Hi, it is Özlem. So you can ask questions now. You can raise your hand if you want from the chat thing, or you can write a question from the chat. But I can maybe start by asking two questions. The first one is to Barry. So what can be the urgent strategies to fight with the new global crisis? So what are the urgent ones? And the other one is to Marcus. And how do you think the resistances are going to be affected by the crisis?
Oh, well, that's it's a difficult challenge. It's hard to know where to start. I mean, I am making the argument that the climate change and ecological breakdown crisis still remains the most imminent existential threat, and the corona is temporary, although a product of that. But so we have to continue the fight to try to arrest the cumulative increase and the annual increase in global greenhouse gas emissions. That's primary, and that's for the next decade, because we have to halve greenhouse gas emissions on this planet by 2030 if we're on track to try to bring this situation under control before we reach thresholds that lead to irreversible changes and possibly chaotic situation. I think everyone's fully aware of that. So that still involves many campaigns about how to do that. There are lots of different proposals out there. And when it comes to extractivism, again, for example, on the political level, fighting the extractivist projects becomes more important than ever. And reinventing global solidarity with people all over the world and throughout the whole global south is vitally important. And many people are working on that. So I urge people to be involved with that. That's a form of transformative praxis where you show your solidarities with people who are at the front line globally. If you conceptualize this as a global struggle, which I think it is, then that is one of the key arenas in which we have to act. And the global arena of that are some of the things I mentioned before, to take part in really trying to radically change the governance structure, the global governance structure. I mean, we've seen some really ugly and serious failures of the global governance structure over this pandemic. I mean, global public health as a right, and to be fully resourced, to have coherent global approaches that also embed global justice and equality for all people. That is a huge program to work on, because we've been made acutely aware of how important it is. That is all part of the same response, in a sense. You could talk about a global carbon price. You could talk about even the banning, the outright illegality of new fossil fuel extractivist projects anywhere in the world, starting anywhere. I mean, personally, for example, and because we're located in Helsinki, the Arctic really, it's global, with global social forces and civil society activists, lawyers, everyone that we could mobilize, trying to protect the Arctic from any further exploitation of fossil fuels. There are so many ways in which we could talk about it. And Marcus, last thing I'll say is Marcus mentioned about the global meat production and consumption sphere, which is hugely important to all of this, to all of it, to every element of the, the ecological breakdown, species extinction, climate change. It's all related. And the meat industry globally, and the way that the intensification of all the production processes has been accelerated in recent decades. I mean, this has got to be brought under a new set of controls. Maybe others have better ideas, but those are some things off the top of my head that, for starters.
So yeah, thank you for the question. So maybe how has Corona impacted resistance? So one thing that has happened is that I think that the paths have diverged, and they are going to diverge with Corona. We don't have simple political answers, but the political paths will be different, and I think we are already seeing this a little bit. Now, this is because on the one hand, as I found out, for example, that protesting, physical protesting in not in the virtual space, but actually in physical space, which is noted, was really important. And many of those resisting, or actually almost all of those resisting the extractivist projects are landed people. They are like people on a certain place, on a locality. And if you are banning, like now currently there is a ban of for example, protests and other mass gatherings, then that is problematic. Then on the other hand, when you don't have the law enforcement in place, in places such as Amazon or elsewhere, then there's an unrule of law and violence and so on. And then these local people have to maybe find other solutions that are not so dependent on the state. So those struggles become much more local, and maybe there's not so much attention paid to them globally. Now, currently, for example, mining is stopped in many places, for example, in Peru, but there's a very strong lobby by the corporations to reopen it. And I don't know in which sense the resistance there, for example, might be enabled to participate in counter lobbying and stuff like that. But then again, we see that I think that as a whole, this corona crisis gives possibilities for example, for the Brazilian landless movement. They have been distributing the food to the hungry people in Brazil. I have friends in Brazil who are markets and so on, but the landless farmers movement, they have a lot of landed people and producing food in the settlements, and they have been distributing this food to people, and then their popularity has been rising. So I think peasant farming and this kind of like local food sovereignty will gain popularity, because we see that we cannot trust on these global commodity networks for producing all our stuff and food. So there will be a kind of like, maybe there are definitely opportunities for redrawing the current very problematic rules of the World Trade Organization and so on, which prohibit, for example, rules based on the pollution of agriculture, so that you could favor production that is more organic or so on. And this is hugely important, like Barry mentioned, because the biodiversity loss by agro-extractivism is hugely related to pandemics.
Thank you very much for your responses. We have now 2 questions so far. One is from Franklin to both of you. What is the place of cities in global extractivism? Part of the problem being spaces of modernity. And we have a question from Usman. Would you like to take it like one by one? Is it better? Barry, Marcus?
One by one is fine.
Because there are 2 questions, one from Franklin, one from Usman. So shall I ask both to you?
We've heard the one by Franklin. Yes, what is the place of cities in global? And what's the other one?
The other one is from Usman. It is, how do you make sense of rise of neo-infrastructural developmentalism in the framework of extractivism in Asian context, particularly China's developmental ambitions and resultant developmental programs by Japan, USA, and India? And you can see the questions in the chat box if you want.
Well, I can shortly answer to this question by Usman first, that now with China, we see that, for example, most of the infrastructure there has been built in the past 10 years. And that has created a lot of the problems related to extractivism and its resistance in India and Brazil, for example, in the past decade, because there's been such a huge moving of physical terrain from those places, iron ore, steel and other metals, sand, and so on, to China. But now it's been built, so I see that there might be a lessening of that infrastructure now.
If I add a footnote to that, many of you may have seen the statistic that China has laid more concrete in the past, I think it's even less than 2 decades, than the United States laid in an entire century. And concrete is all part of that infrastructural juggernaut that China has implemented. And concrete is one of the most polluting substances that we produce in the world, and particularly for
greenhouse gas creation for climate change. I mean, there's a huge need for the entire architectural profession, construction industry, and to move away from concrete. So that's just one of the implications. I mean, our post-extractivist construction industry would virtually abandon most of the present scale of the use of concrete.
Then about this question by Franklin, so I think maybe there will be, or definitely there will be a change in this rural-urban division with the pandemic, at least in Finland or elsewhere. People might start to see cities as less safe places, and there might be a move back to the countryside, and kind of agrariization policies might gain more ground. Yeah.
I would say that, I mean, cities in some ways, because of a high, throughout history for 5 millennia, because of a high concentration of population and many other aspects of the way that class, society, and state are structured, have been drivers. Cities have often been, not always in history, there are some other models, but have often been drivers of certain kinds of very large scale mass production extractivist projects. I mean, the Roman Empire was guilty of an enormous amount of deforestation, for example. You can make many examples. And Rome is the metropole, where you get consuming classes in the city who are entirely dependent on extraordinarily extensive long distance supply chains. And that's become true now globally. You have a consumerist culture of capitalist modernity that draws upon extraction all over the planet. Jason Moore, it's all talking about cheap nature. That's very important analysis. Cheap is only possible because of basically a false paradigm of economics, which places externalities at the center of the model, actually, when in reality those externalities all have, in a sense, real consequences, many of which are entropy, depletion, ecocide, and so on. So radically altering the urban mode of social existence is very important, particularly now that for the first time in human history, more than 50% of the human population live in cities. And there are many, many cities all over the world trying to come up with ambitious new programs, partly to do with climate change, of course, but also to do with the new paradigms of the circular economy. In a way, it's kind of deglobalization impetus and relocalization. There's been commentary about this crisis at present, Corona, that many corporations, entities will re-examine their global supply chain strategies because of vulnerability and disruption and profit loss and so on. I mean, there are different ways in which relocalization, which has been advocated by some critical theorists for quite some time as a counter strategy to neoliberal economic globalization. They're coming more into their own now. I just read that Kate Raworth, who wrote Donut Economics, has been basically commissioned by, I think it's the city of Amsterdam, to come up with a comprehensive plan for her model of the resilient circular economy for the city. I mean, I think that's that there may be many cities that will be looking at that kind of thing, and many other entities who will be looking at, in a sense, some version of a deglobalization strategy. And that, so it could be that the urban terrain we see around the world, at least in part, will radically change, and one might argue needs to do so.
Thank you very much. And we have one more question from Maya. And the question is how to get ordinary middle class involved in these resistance struggles, those who are not directly affected and who seem not to be interested in politics.
Well, that's a good question. Well, at least in those cases where you have the threat of an extractivist project destroying the local way of life, then it's easier, of course, to mobilize people. But it has needed a kind of like a work on the ground. So people have been going from door to door, organizing meetings, telling what kind of change that would bring to the neighborhood and so on. So in that case, yeah, it takes efforts, I would say, talking and networking with people.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, for example, this crisis with the COVID, the virus, has created a great deal of action on the local level in communities. I mean, the mutual aid groups, for example, which I'm sitting here in Northern England. In my own city, mutual aid groups have been set up across the entire city, and in some of the wards, they have hundreds of volunteers just for one area, a ward, and every street has a responsible monitor to help people who need help and who contact the group for a whole variety of ways they might need help in this crisis. They're not so the resurgence of sociability in so many ways as people find ways to reunite. I think that's important, and that's involved all classes in my city here, Newcastle upon Tyne, as far as I know. It's not restricted to working class or middle class. It's gone across everyone. So that's an indication of what could happen when we're faced with imminent existential threat, as we are right now, and when people begin to have more and more realization, and if they're also in many ways given the information by many other means, that's part of an awakening. And so I really do anticipate that, and it's necessary. It was just we're waiting for a regime change in politics and for an enlightened and progressive government to come along and do all the right things is wonderful if that happens, and if you fight for that to happen, that's all good. But it may not happen. But there are other ways, and people take things themselves under their own control and self-organize. And I think that that's one of the great strengths that we have and that we will have to address these crises together.
Thank you. We have two more questions. One is from Mossi to both of you. How about universal basic income as an alternative to the extractivist development? There has now been talk about even global universal schemes with this coronavirus. What do you think about this? And the other question is from Dayabati, and the question is, I'm not so optimistic regarding the resistance movement in India. So the question is to Marcus. The land of the indigenous people are regularly acquired by the people for illegal mining in West Bengal. Land alienation is a normal phenomenon. So here you go.
Yeah, of course, in India, as elsewhere, in most of the cases, it's not so easy to resist, and mostly the extractivist impetus wins. But in the global comparison, especially when comparing with Brazil, for example, in the iron ore sector between 2005 and 2015, you saw that about half of the iron ore mines in India were shut down or discontinued their operations, and they have remained mostly so in, for example, in places like Goa. And this is really globally unprecedented. And I think there is kind of history to resistance that is very inspiring in India, from Gandhi and Ambedkar and so on, which is not present so much elsewhere. I mean, the Indians are very self-critical, but I think there should be a time there also for so recognizing the some successes there.
Should I speak to universal basic income?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it has become a political demand, and for example, here in Britain, and people are rallying to it. Some are, and it as of course, for the time being, as a temporary measure that absolutely everyone must have an income. And that principle can then be expanded upon as we come out of the immediate COVID crisis. That can be interpreted in many different ways. As the absolute right to a sufficient, adequate income for everyone, and other basic elements like public health as a right,
which leads to renationalization of fragmented and privatized neoliberalized health systems, for example, as a political program going forward. So I mean, I think universal basic income remains debated and is controversial. Some are very much for it, others not. I won't go into that debate, but I think that in the short term, it's a necessity, in fact, so that a great many, vast billions of people would not suffer really very severely as weeks of lockdown possibly become months. Without an income or adequate income, you can imagine consequences that are already going on for a great many people. I mean, they are here in Britain already. We know about this. And, the number of unemployed is skyrocketing in a number of countries and might do globally. So it is the time for radical proposals, of which universal basic income is one. It's not a new idea, it's an old one. But that kind of radical thinking is what we need, and we need to have it realized. That's going to be based on new politics, new mobilizations, new campaigns and demands that make it real. And I hope that's what's going to happen.
I think in the example of Brazil currently is helpful, that if you don't give money, targeted money to people, for example, in the Amazon who are lacking now money, they will feel tempted to go to dig gold and then but the high prices and cause deforestation. So there should be a return of the policies that used to be there, like this Bolsa Familia kind of policy of Bolsa Verde, this kind of green fund, where you give money against that you don't, then you can show that you don't deforest, for example. So there are possibilities for that, and I think they would be really urgent right now to give that kind of like cash transfers in a targeted way to the people, so that they can survive through the crisis.
Thanks a lot to both of you. Do we have more questions from the audience? You can raise your hand or say, okay, you can write your questions from the chat box. Okay, we have two. So Erwin is asking how many organizations, collectives, indigenous communities, social movements are collaborating with EXALT for stopping the negative impacts of extractivism, such as mega projects around the world or in the Arctic, and what are the concrete actions done? And a follow-up question to Dayabati, to Barry. I have translated your article in Bengali. My Bengali friend is that achieving the alternative system is not so simple. There are layers of power. What do you say?
Could I start with that collaborators, and I'm sure Marcus can help. One, for example, is the People's Sovereignty Lab, and this is a group from around the world, primarily of people located in the global South in social movements, many different kinds, many of which are in resistance to extractivist projects, but not exclusively. But that this group has been evolving for over 2 years, and they are collaborating with EXALT, and in our conference in the autumn in Helsinki, that we are actively planning a Helsinki dialogue with 30 or 40 members of the People's Sovereignty Network, and so that this is a way of co-creating and sharing knowledge of experiences and strategies to transform conditions, and forming a kind of people's solidarity amongst the movements. It's one type of action which is, where you to answer the question, this is a new kind of international social movement solidarity that EXALT is involved in directly. And so I recommend you could look up the People's Sovereignty Lab online, and even join or contribute to it. To Dayabati, I'm deeply grateful that you've translated it. Thank you so much into Bengali. Thank you. And I hope you'll just go ahead and share it freely.
for people who can read it in Bengali. I mean, it's an idea piece, as people have said, and it was written in a moment where I thought that it was some element of how all of this it leads us to, at least in the thinking process, that that we now dare to be as radical as possible. And where that leads, of course, is not in any single way, direction, method, organization. Of course, what I've said has a lot of limitations, but I was hoping to stimulate like a process, and then it's only one little contribution of it to what I think is already a very large and expanding conversation globally. So it was just participating in that, really, for what it's worth, and hopefully for some people it has helped them to think more deeply about how profound the crisis is. That isn't just Corona, that we're facing, and that really you have to start to decide how it is that you're going to act. What kind of transformative praxis are you going to take up? What kind of solidarities are you going to build? What is your strategy? What are your arenas and networks? And to get going and to realize that this is no time for minor reformism. Minor reformism will not do. It will take much more, and it will either go disastrously into chaotic directions, which we can already see the seeds happening, or by us opposing, and massively so, we could hopefully change the direction and save the future from this kind of dystopian outcome, which is very real and even likely. The dystopian outcomes, we can see it, but we have to fight it. There's no choice. We have to fight it. If people choose the way, they will fight it. And I was encouraging them to dream big, demand the impossible. And now's the time. It's not impossible, actually. So demand it.
And if I could add to the question about partner organizations of EXALT, we are currently working, doing the footwork to gather more partners and grow our community, as we are an emerging initiative, and it is at the center of what EXALT is doing, as I guess all of the members really strongly believe that the way forward is kind of finding unity in diversity and working towards common goals.
Marcus, would you like to add something?
Yes, maybe a little bit. Yes, definitely. So please feel welcome to join us or send the link to anybody who might be interested. So yeah, so this is just starting the EXALT initiative, and very open, also beyond the academia. So yeah, I think it's very useful to use this organizing concept as a tool to kind of have these kind of debates, discussions, and continue these with the conference, and even before that in different sessions, and even after that in different ways, and thinking about how to bring this forward. Well, then about the question of change. Well, what I found when talking to hundreds of different activists and key like movement members was that what they said was that they really didn't know what will work when they started to resist. So they used all kind of resistance strategies. And they were really surprised in many cases about their success or the outcomes. So you really don't know. The world is very complex. You cannot know what will happen and how, for example, will events like Corona or stuff like that affect politics. So you never know what will happen. So the best thing to do is to keep on trying with the resistance strategies, for example, that have been found to be working especially in those contexts where you are at. Of course, contexts are different. If you are located in a place where there is a civil war or an authoritarian regime, of course, you have to kind of use a bit different methods. But then there are also ways to try to have a say and change the world to the better direction also in there. So I would be kind of like having that kind of attitude here. Also thinking that the current way of doing things cannot continue for long. So there will be this kind of, like Barry mentioned now, that there was the unexpected impact of Corona, that more solidarity and so on. So actually showing the good sides of humanity and so on. So I think that's the way to think about it.
Thank you. And we have almost like 10 minutes more. If you have more questions, please write. Or say, okay, we have one. It is from German. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I'm not an expert in the issue, but I'm seeing the concern about how the militarization of life and warfare, which are related to many extractivist projects, it has increased during the pandemic of COVID-19. How do you see this? I'm asking this especially in a particular case in Latin America context, which is Colombia, with a post-conflict context in a still volatile and violent internal political setting. There is a reading piece recommended, which you can see from the chat. Barry, Sana, Marcus?
Well, Marcus, could you talk about that?
Yes, of course, this issue of whole Colombian peace process has led to increase in deforestation and violation of community rights in a kind of like unexpected way, paramilitarization in Colombia, and so on. So this is a very problematic case, because then it's not promising good for other peace processes, for example, revolutionaries to lay off their arms. So yeah, we might be, I think this is, the overall tendency might be that we are heading towards a more chaotic world, a chaos in the world system, like many have, like Wallerstein and so on, have said already for decades, and others, like Barry. But so we have governments like those of Bolsonaro and Trump and so on, which are having very different approaches than other governments and so on. So the situation of chaos gives both more possibilities, but also more violence that will happen in other places. So I see here again that we have divergent political processes and dynamics unfolding now. It's become more complex.
I'm sure that many of you have seen that the United Nations Secretary General called for a global ceasefire. Well, that's good for the time being, if it were to be honored. But I've advocated. I mean, I'm hoping that this will lead to a revival of the peace movement in the form of a call for a serious new effort at disarmament. I mean, and that's not only nuclear weapons. I mean, it's if social forces all over the world can really mobilize around this, as we are doing with climate change, I think that again they're inextricably interlinked. The vast resources that are put into the arms race and an increase in the nuclear arms race in recent years, the vast trillions that are spent, as we go into the absolute necessity to radically change the technological structure and industrial structure, the housing, the energy, the food systems of the world, that vast sums are needed to be deployed to realize that program. I mean, it's huge, and the military budget around the world, and particularly, the most expensive armaments, which has been going in the wrong direction in recent years, to increase the tension and increase the expenditure and make it more dangerous, including with nuclear weapons. Really, and then
whatever we can do as human beings to try to demand that this be arrested, reversed, that those resources be redeployed, would build international peace, make new treaties. Personally, I think that we should go back to 1961 and the McCloy-Zorn agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was signed, which was an agreement for general and complete disarmament to be in phases. I mean, it's been completely forgotten and was not realized despite arms control talks and so on, and some limited disarmament at certain points. But now we're in a very dangerous situation, and it really it's an imperative that it has to be reversed, and we need the resources, vast trillions that need to be redeployed. So that this has to be a key demand. We have to build the culture of international peace and have disarmament.
Thank you very much. We can get the last question if there is one more. I'm looking at the chat box. Sometimes it comes a little bit later. Okay, last question from German again. When one sees at the local context, even in the so-called global south, also you could find local communities supporting extractivist projects or endorsing actively processes of socio-ecological dispossession. As researchers, what are the methodological challenges to understand the everyday and more local manifestations of multiple extractivist projects?
Thank you. That is a really good question. So I definitely think that researchers shouldn't focus only on the resistance cases or successful resistance cases, but there should be a focus on the whole scale of investment politics or the politics of extraction. So for example, in India, there were many cases where the local Adivasi indigenous people were actually protesting for the reopening of the mines so that they could return to jobs in the mines. And those have to be understood because they are really behind the kind of explanations of why we have the rise of authoritarian rural populism, for example, recently around the world in different places. So I think we need to engage with both aspects here.
I would just add to that how important the concept of a just transition is, which is becoming more prominent now, that by necessity, and its timing is contemporary. The just transition that we must make certain kinds of radical, large-scale technological infrastructural changes to the mode of material existence on this planet, to the manner in which global political economy is organized and realized in practices. It's a necessity for human survival, you might say. But to leave workers behind, their communities, their families, their livelihood, just leave them in the dust, not caring. This is grotesque. And so the just transition is the process, to fight for politically that there must be transformations and transitions. They will impact old ways of earning a living, but you've got to give people another way of making a living, which is more positive and constructive, more more sane. It fits into the new way of doing things. So that I would just advocate. I just remind us all that the argument that that you cannot change something because you'll take away someone's livelihood is deeply problematic when those livelihoods are threatening everyone with deepening crisis. So I mean that's not an easy question, but the just transition concept helps us to deal with that if it's realized in practice.
And so the last one, the last one coming from Urbana, and the question is: extractivism in Africa is more about extracting profit than promoting local development. Are they ways of promoting development via extractivism? Barry or Marcus?
Let's see if Marcus could.
Well, it depends how you define extractivism. I mean, or development in that sense. If you see that development is always something negative as a process, then yeah, extractivism could be used to promote that kind of development if extractivism is also seen as a negative process. But yeah, I think that this kind of organizing concept of extractivisms, global extractivisms, can be used to make rethink the timelines of development. I mean, for how long will that kind of like project that you are having now be developmental if it's depleting the soils or creating pollution and so on? I mean, what kind of long-term impacts you will have? So you will be thinking in longer time frames, like mining not during the next 1 year, but during the next 1,000 years. How long will the resource be there? Also for the future generations and so on. So I think it offers possibilities for rethinking that what is capital and what is production and so on. Like in Brazil, I was talking with Ladislav Dobor, renowned economist there, and asking like, so what do you think of the highly productive agricultural agribusiness sector? And he was just looking at me after that question and saying that, well, you know, I don't know where to start because it's not productive at all. It's completely unproductive capital because it's destroying the soil, which is our most important capital. So that kind of questioning can be used based on the extractivism concept.
I would just add to that there are many groups and many economists and political economists, international political economists, others, philosophers, who are all working on a critique of the dominant versions of economics as a discipline, and that how the dominant way of projecting what economics is as a body of knowledge is now under assault, and as it should be. And this is one of the most important things that's happening, and that academics contribute to, is that overturning the dominance of, in a sense, a deeply faulty, hugely flawed paradigm of standard economics, and all that flows from it. I mean, in many ways, the crises that we're in is a product of the dominance of that particular kind of economic paradigm. And we saw it exposed nakedly in the great financial crisis not so very long ago. The very people who had advocated market efficiency on a global scale, the elimination of systemic risk through self-regulation, deregulation of financial markets, etc., were given Nobel Prizes. But in reality, in the real world economy, it was a catastrophe. Their ideas were completely wrong, I would say, and many others did say at the time. So now writ large, the whole edifice of the growthism, capital-centered economics with externality. I mean, the Herman Daly has done so much to overturn. This is a big enterprise that's going on by a lot of people. With that paradigm, intellectually and then politically, has got to be overthrown. That's a necessity of our time. We need a new economics. Many people are working on it to realize it, in theory and in practice.
Thank you very much for all of our speakers, Sana, Barry, and Marcus, to have this timely discussion in these uncertain times. And thank you to all of you who participated, listened, or asked questions, interesting and important questions to us. And of course, thanks a lot to the Global South Encounters team to make this session happen. And please contact with EXALT group for more discussion and interaction to continue to talk about or think about extractivism. And of course, we all wish you a healthy and safe days in the coming future. So thank you.